The South American Republic of Chile has entered a position of political peril. On October 18th of 2019, disgruntled masses of students situated in the capital Santiago took to its streets to voice their opinions on the increase of subway fares in the city. Soon after, the protest shifted gears to growing inequality that was a product of the Pinochet administration from 1973 to 1990. Economic inequality is fairly easy to highlight as it prevails through much of the society, from subpar pensions to a failing healthcare system, one which will be brought to its knees by the coronavirus pandemic in the following months. Despite all this, Chile has carved out a space in the South American economy as one of its prevailing members, yet within its borders, its middle class is stalling and the poor are growing. So, where is all this money going to? As luck would have it, most of that economic prowess is situated within the elite, who are taxed less, have higher and more stable pensions, and are generally favored by the government. The gruesome violence of the protests have backed current President Sebastián Piñera into a narrow corner from which he cannot escape from. Things are looking gloomy for old Sebastian, as the state's response to the protests have claimed lives of many and injured thousands. So, Piñera's plan? Total appeasement. In the wake of the violence, Piñera has made promises to restructure the healthcare system, increase the minimum wage, and announce the drafting of a new constitution, the first since the fall of Pinochet. Nothing major. So far, the protests have barely subsided as students continue to take to the streets to voice their ulterior opinions on government and what should be in the new constitution.
On October 6, 2019, the government of Chile declared that they are increasing the price of metro fares by 30 pesos during rush hours. This is about 4 cents. This led to a lot of unhappiness in the Chilean people as they had trouble getting by with what they were making already. This might come as a surprise to the international community and other countries of Latin America because of the place the Chilean economy has in the area. But if you take a deeper look, it is easy to understand that most of this wealth is concentrated in the hands of the Chilean elite. There is a lot of inequality in Chile. The increased cost of living, low wages and pensions, a lack of education rights, and the poor public health system has pushed citizens to always want more and protest when the government implements laws that will hurt their pockets. This was the case when the metro fares increased. The first people to protest were high school and college students, who on October 18, 2019, called on Chilean citizens to dodge fares and not pay. The response from the police was heavy-handed in the train stations, and they were even called criminals by President Piñera himself. A picture of President Piñera celebrating his grandson's birthday on October 18th as students were clashing with the police infuriated people more with how out of touch current politicians were with regular citizens. The demonstrations quickly turned deadly, and people were burning down buses, train stations, and even buildings. A state of emergency was declared on October 19, 2019, and President Piñera even lowered his tone towards the protesters in order to calm them, but the excess use of force by the military by firing tear gas and water cannons angered people of Chile so much that even when President Piñera overturned the metro fares, the demonstrations did not stop but were growing more and more. The deployment of the military in the streets of Santiago and other cities had not happened in Chile since their return to democracy. The United Nations Human Rights Commissioners and the international community called for investigations into the excess use of force by the military and urged people to refrain from using violence.
In response to the escalating protests, President Piñera attempted to wrestle control of the situation forcibly by declaring a state of emergency in the capital, Santiago. This gave the military control over the city's policing to try and regain control of the situation. However, the protests continued unabated. The military couldn't take control of the streets. By this point, the protests had become about Chile's neoliberal economic system, a holdover from the Pinochet era anchored by the 1980s constitution, instituted by the military. Piñera decided to withdraw the bus fare hike, as well as promise new social benefits like better pensions, better health benefits, higher taxes on the rich, and politicians receiving pay cuts. None of this was enough. Piñera, after meeting with congressional leaders and his own party Vamos, agreed to begin the process of creating a new constitution. This declaration set the ball in the process. As a year after the protests began, Chileans went to the polls to decide who would actually draft the new constitution. The new Constitutional Convention membership was to be made up either of all independents or made up half of directly elected independents and half sitting congressmen and congresswomen. This vote represented a major setback to the establishment parties, both the center-right and the neoliberal-aligned center-left. In the first 2020 vote, the people decided for all directly elected independents to make up the process. And in May 2021, the election determining who they actually were, radical leftist anti-neoliberal members aligned with the protest movement in new parties saw their elected members decimate the traditional center-left parties, such as the Socialist Party. Chilean politics had now become about the protests and the aftermath of the protests.
I'm going to talk about Chile's political establishment's immediate reaction to the protests. The Chileans lost trust in their political parties. It fell from 53% in January 2006 to 14% when the protests began. This was reflected mostly in the left-wing parties, which largely collapsed and had new ones grow back in their death. The old center-left parties and pro-market parties died out and were replaced with a new coalition of socialist radical, broad front, feminist groups, student organizing groups, etc. Support for the broad front nearly doubled since the protests started. Similarly, the Communist Party used to be so small that it wasn't polled, and it now sits at around 20%. The new left is large and diverse, but it's not nearly as united, and this can be reflected by some on the left criticized Boric for signing an agreement with the government that ended the protests in exchange for the constitutional convention, and the thinking behind this was that the protests had been doing so well that you might as well keep continuing them to see if you can get any more gains. The right wing has actually become much more hard-fast in their beliefs and has not splintered like the left had. They've become centered around caste. They mostly centered around caste because of his use of strongman language. He used the language of law and order as a reaction to the protests, which gained him support for those who disagreed with the protests or thought that the protesters took it too far. I found a really interesting BBC article where they kind of do a voter profile for people who are voting for either candidate or centrist candidates. And one of the voters that is supporting caste was quoted as saying, "The fundamental thing for me is that he talks about recovering social peace and the rule of law and safeguarding civil order."
Chile has been rattled by political and social protest over inequality and the rising cost of living, with COVID exposing and exacerbating pre-existing inequalities. Until recently, Chile was regarded as one of South America's most stable and prosperous democracies, and for decades was run by centrist parties. In the upcoming election, voters are left with a choice between two very contrasting candidates who offer starkly opposed visions of the future. The contrasting candidates illustrate Chileans' growing dissatisfaction with the status quo. Boric wants to overhaul Chile's market-friendly economy and political system and has run his campaign on a strongly anti-neoliberal agenda. Although neoliberalism has made Chile one of South America's wealthiest economies, it has created stark economic disparities and trapped many Chileans into debt. Chile was previously a global model for free trade and a magnet for foreign investments. The business community is concerned about the upcoming elections after decades of having their interests protected under centrist rule. Boric has called for increased state involvement in the economy and an end to the privatisation of public services. There is a fear that if Boric is elected, it will scare off private investors. By contrast, Cast is committed to the defence of the neoliberal economic model. Anger at the political ruling class has opened the door to populist rule. The political divide has jolted a country that has long stood out in a politically volatile Latin America. Chile's election is a window into Latin America's growing polarisation.
Jose Cast, who is the current presidential candidate in the 2021 Chilean presidential election, has a very interesting background. His father was a former Nazi military officer who fled the country after World War II and landed in Chile with the help of the Vatican. Jose Cast's family is also suspected of being part of General Pinochet's dictatorship. Although the direct ties cannot be proven definitively, The fact that this rumor is widespread in Chile suggests that Chilean population would accept that to be true. Jose Cas has run his campaign entirely on what we would call identity politics. He has put particularly the issue of gender roles at the foremost of his campaign. He has also stressed traditional family values in relation to the Catholic Church. He also is very well known for being anti-immigrant and being anti-crime. Jose Cas' message has really hit a nerve with Chilean voters in the wake of the various protests we've seen in recent years. Many on the right have felt that these protests were a nuisance or annoying, and Jose Cas' message of law and order has particularly been received well by those voters. Jose Cas' opponent is a self-described anti-neoliberalist. He's on the far left of the Chilean political spectrum, or at least further left than the current left is, and he has made his entire campaign being against neoliberal economic policies. He famously said, if Chile was the birthplace of neoliberal economic policies in Latin America, then it can also be its casket. Although Gabriel Boric had for a long time voiced his opposition to working with what he calls center-left politicians, he has in fact in recent months began to form coalitions with various centrist liberals and conservatives in the country in an attempt to prevent Cas from winning the election.
To finish off, I'll be discussing the political background of each candidate. We'll start with Cast. He's a Chilean lawyer and politician with a history of political involvement. From 1996 to 2000, he was a councilman in the city of Buin. From 2002 to 2018, he was a member of the Chamber of Deputies. In terms of political parties, he was a member of the Independent Democratic Union until 2016, when he became an independent until 2019, and after that he created the Chilean Republican Party. He can be considered a supporter of far-right politics. His support base mainly comes from the right-wing, conservatives, nationalists, retired military, and also libertarians. He promotes less taxes, less government, is also pro-life, anti-illegal immigration, supports a military government and religion in schools. His 2021 campaign is focused on law and order, anti-immigration, and supporting the free market economy. In addition, he opposes abortion, same-sex marriage, and expansion of LGBT rights. In Cast's own words, he calls the 2021 election a choice between freedom and communism. Boric has a more limited appearance in the political arena, but this is mostly due to his young age. He is currently 35, 20 years younger than his opponent. Boric's rise to prominence was based on his leadership during the 2011 student protests. At university, he joined a political collective known as Izquierda Autónoma, and would go on to become the president of the Students' Union Law Department. The 2011 college protests would support lowering the prices of education and a deeper look at the quality of said education based on its cost. His leadership here would make him a hero for the younger generation, and these would be his main supporters in his political career. From 2013 to 2021, Boric would receive the highest number of votes in his region to gain a seat in the Chamber of Deputies. He would sit on the Human Rights and Indigenous Peoples Council and be re-elected for the Chamber of Deputies with an increased number of votes since his last election. In the 2021 election, he gives off the impression of a leftist lawmaker. He promises to include an expansion to the safety net and promotes decentralization, feminism, climate change activism, and what he calls dignified work. In continuity with the 2011 protests, Boric pushes for free, high-quality education.